Good. Good morning. Good morning. All right.
Hey, Linda.
Good
Morning.
Hi there. We've got Joe. Hello, Joe. I heard your voice.
Hey.
Hello.
Oops, we're going to see ourselves twice here. So bear with me as I get through the logistics.
Hi there, Linda.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Put this on mute and we'll get started in just a moment. Excellent. All right. Well, why don't we just go ahead and get things kicked off here, and good early morning to Rod Cherkis, who's joining us from California. So thank you, Rod, for coming out. We'll give you a formal introduction in a moment. But just as a friendly reminder for those that are joining us, we record this live. So you don't want to say anything unintentional or inadvertently about any trade secrets. It's totally your option whether you want to go video or not. But usually the way we kind of tee this up, Megan and I, we start with the weekly poll, which we'll get to in a moment, and then we'll turn over to our guest to get his point of view, and then open it up to the topic this morning, which will really be on the retention, cross-sell, upsell, and kind of the CX and CS side of the bow tie. So yeah, just looking at our poll here, each week we do a poll, and this week I asked a question about where do you get your information in terms of making a decision as you're buying. If you're comparing competitive information, where do you go out and get validation or more information? I gave a couple choices here, Slack, Zoom, and the vendor. And, you know, I think, Megan, you've got a really interesting perspective here because you were kind of this resource back in the day as kind of the aggregator of a lot of this information. But I think what's kind of cropped up since the time of Sirius is the Slack peer communities have really taken a life here of their own. I'm involved in a number of them, and I know a few of you are as well. And then also the vendors, especially on the MarTech side. One comment I heard, I just got back from a conference up in Boston, the first live conference in 18 months, but a person said, you know, in a way, I'm kind of tired about hearing from the vendors, but on the other side, they're the ones that are really showing the thought leadership, and they're the ones that are doing this. So I rely heavily on what they're saying. So I thought that was a pretty interesting data point, but I'd be curious, you know, Megan, given your history, how do you feel about this?
So this is interesting. You know, I thought the Slack communities, I'm kind of not surprised because you see the rise of things like Revenue Collective, now Pavilion, of like Women in Revenue is something that I'm part of. They've got a super active channel in terms of not just, you know, talking about, you know, relevant topics, but hiring as well. Like, there are all sorts of Slack-based communities that are just doing really, really well. And because it seems unfiltered and unbiased, right? Depending on the community, of course, but you feel like you've got this sort of safe space depending on how well curated the membership of that community is. And I think that creates what people want, which is people that they believe would have the right kinds of knowledge to help them make a decision, provide them with unfiltered, their direct feedback. And that's why I think you're seeing that. I think when you said though vendor, I think this is important, right? What you're saying is it's peer reviews. So it's kind of the same thing that you're getting from the Slack communities, right? It's about saying, well, what do other people like me or like the people that I'm making this purchase for, what do they think about this company? And I mean, even people going to Glassdoor and LinkedIn and like seeing feedback on how those people are hiring and what roles they're thinking about and what people say about what it's like to work there, because of course, employee experience is a big part of customer experience and sort of brand perception. So all those things, right? And you can't hide. I think that's the key too, is if you're not doing a great job, people know. I don't think that you can cover it up. And that's what this is saying too. It'll come out one way or the other, formally, informally, or both. But on the other side, if you're doing a fantastic job, this is where you see, I think, some smaller companies really shine, because all it takes is a couple of influential advocates in these informal channels to start a really great conversation. One of the things we talk about at Winning by Design is the concept of customer-led growth, where you create this virtuous cycle of selling the right things to the right customers, delivering impact, and then creating a recurring revenue engine that creates organic advocacy that becomes this really great efficiency contributor to your revenue engine. And I think that's what you see happening here. And the trick is be on the right side of it, do a good job for your customers. And this shouldn't be scary. This should be empowering.
That's a great tie-in to our guest today too, Rod. I mean, you've had a great run at Marketo running professional services, Gainsight, even had an interim support role at Engagio running the customer side of things. How do you view the poll, just out of curiosity, or what's your experience here?
Yeah, I've found that the Slack communities are getting increasingly interesting because they create narrow groups of individuals with similar types of experiences and challenges. So Megan mentioned Revenue Collective, now Pavilion. In my part of the sort of the functions, there's groups around technical support, there's groups around onboarding and implementation, there's lots of groups around the customer success and customer success management function, that at least it creates a small number of potential vendors to investigate. I'm not sure that it's when someone says, hey, this is the one, that you go and buy it, but it's definitely a narrowing function to say what's been the experience, and you can get a sense of is that company the same size that you are, and does it have a relevant type of recommendation? So I see that to be a really great first look. And then there's tons of resources after that to go deep into each vendor, whether it's their materials themselves, watching their YouTube videos or partners that have created, that I think also start to round out the story about, is this solution right for me?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense in what you're saying there. And, I just, I mentioned the B2B SMX was an event that I just came from. And one of the themes or topics that came up was the other side of the bow tie, as Megan refers to it, is really the upsell, the cross sell, the retention side. I was really surprised to hear how frequently that came up in a lot of the dialogues. Do you have a viewpoint, Rod, on what you see in terms of maybe even marketing's role? Like, how do you think of things there in terms of who are the touch points on that side of the bow tie?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on your discussion today. And maybe I can just provide context for those folks that are on the call. So I've been an operating executive in post-sale functions at a number of companies that have gone through lots of fast growth as they've built out their businesses. I worked at Intuit for a long time, and then probably relevantly, I worked at RingCentral for a couple of years, leading all of their post-sale functions. I worked at Marketo, leading their enablement and training, their professional services piece. And then most recently, I worked at Gainsight, where I led their professional services and education business. And I recently started a consulting business called Hello CCO, working with chief customer officers and their post-sale leaders to help them identify and then execute strategies to help them through these various growth stages. Because what I was seeing in the market was a lot of these organizations experience the same pain points at relatively similar times in their journeys, right? There's what do you do to get to 10 million in revenue, and then to 50, and then to 100 and beyond that. And that there are some best practices and plays and tips to help them get through these transitions. And I'm seeing that play out in the market with my clients. So kind of going back to your question about sort of the role of marketing, is I think as these growing enterprise software companies in particular see that their recurring revenue becomes a much bigger and bigger part of their business. There's obviously the new logos and new revenue that comes in, but the big part of a business when you're a $50-100 million company is how are you doing keeping and growing your existing clients? And I don't know that it's an either or. I don't know that marketing can't do both, participate in the lead generation and the funnel at the beginning, but also maybe we can discuss today how marketing can work with those post-sale organizations who are both trying to just retain the existing customers, but also find ways, particularly within larger growth-oriented accounts, to expand through more use or purchasing additional solutions, because those customer-facing teams are literally working with customers all day, every day. And how can the marketing and these post-sale organizations be working with the same plays and messaging to reinforce and have that maximum impact for growth?
So, Rod, I think one of the things we were chatting about before we came on was the fact that that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
And that there is actually a pretty significant disconnect or sort of gulf even between the post-sale functions and marketing in a lot of companies today. And you even mentioned sort of saying, hey, if you're a salesperson, who do you need to engage with? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, and I think for many folks on the line, there are good representation of marketing people, but I think it's important to say, why do we think there's that gulf? Because for all the reasons you just described, there shouldn't be. We should be like partners and making, tons of great positive outcomes for the business from it, but not happening as much.
Yeah, totally. And I'd love to also maybe hear from the folks on the call. So I was leading a discussion online a couple of weeks ago, and I actually had a point of view that I shared that as the chief customer officer or someone in that role leading a services or implementation team and a CSM or account management team and a support organization, that the most important executive relationships for that individual and team to build are with the sales organization, the finance organization, and the product organization, because those can mutually benefit. And my belief that through building those relationships can be most influenced to help the customer-facing teams achieve their outcomes. And a question did come up, which is, why isn't marketing in that group? One, marketing, I think, generally has decent relationships with the team, but where you invest your time was a little bit different. And I think it goes back to where you can influence. I think about incentives. And in a marketing organization, if their incentives are tied to lead generation into the early stage of the funnel, then it's going to be really hard, and I might argue a little bit of a waste of resources and time for those post-sale leaders to try to sort of extract on the margin, work from the marketing team to help them nurture or grow existing clients, or to help sell services, or to help identify other root causes of challenges. Because sometimes that marketing organization is the gatekeeper of, let's say, the Marketo or HubSpot or Eloqua, that is the sort of the nurture stream. So you've seen in products like Gainsight where it takes that away from having to go through the marketing team to communicate with, for example, their journey orchestrator. But there's still a pretty small number of companies that are actually that are able to message to clients without having to go through marketing. So I think it's an interesting question of why doesn't it happen more? There are some companies that are starting to put together customer growth teams or customer marketing organizations where they feel more amenable, because there's actually someone there whose job it is to grow the customers in that base. But I'd love to see more organizations either have that function and bifurcate it, or at least be aware of the need for those two teams to work together.
Well, and Linda or Joe, I'd love to see, if you guys feel like jumping in, have you seen anything in that area, or any evolution from your own companies or other companies that you've worked with where you got kind of more cross-pollination between post-sale and pre-sale? What do you think?
Well, it's funny. I saw the poll, and I think I was reacting to next week's poll. I thought the poll question about the whole RevOps, which sort of ties into what you're talking about here, where I lead a marketing ops. I lead demand gen, which includes marketing ops. And I always feel like there's sort of a competition for resources with sales ops. And yet, there's overlap with reporting, there's some redundancy. And I think like what you're saying, Rod, it really makes sense. It's all tied to the goals. We're fortunately gold on pipeline. So, we're in lockstep with sales, but if we were gold on leads and net new leads only, then we would probably be biased towards resources that support that goal. But we are seeing in our organization, more cross-pollination between the customer success, which is a newly added function. It also oversees implementation and sales, kind of really working closely together. But it is like being in marketing, I do feel like there's a competition for resources because we always need sales ops resources to help us with Salesforce.
Right. Yeah. Do you, is your team the gatekeeper in communicating with customers, and how do you react when one of your post-sale or your customer success leaders comes to you and said, hey, can you help us with this campaign or for doing that? Like, what's your reaction?
Well, it's funny. I think the words you used, you said, do they have to go through marketing? Like and I know you weren't being intentional about that, but when you think about it, we don't want people to look at it that way. Oh, I have to go through marketing.
Right.
And, being the gatekeeper of HubSpot, we should practice what we preach, right? And we should be a cross-organization function. But I feel the pressure, to first support marketing, and that's, probably not a good way to look at it, because we should be supporting the whole function unless we deploy HubSpot functionality resources right into the business line. I don't know if you've seen that. Is that maybe a better model to empower people?
Yeah. I haven't seen it that much, and having worked at Marketo, what would happen is it felt dangerous because maybe someone like you in marketing ops, who was responsible for keeping the data clean and making sure that you didn't have too many unsubscribes, you start giving that power to communicate to I don't know, potentially an unsophisticated user or someone with a different goal, and like, let's just blast everybody and tell them that they should do this next to get more adoption of this feature. And then it causes problems. So I actually like the idea of the gatekeeper of your customers. And the question for me is always, does it need to be an either or, right? Does it need to be, we either drive leads to sales, or we help support the communications to our existing clients to drive retention and expansion? Because you could argue that both of those, if you can do both of those well, that's how you really accelerate growth at a company.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We've seen instances too with the technology owned by different entities. So for example, like Gainsight owned by the CX side, Marketo or marketing automation owned by the marketing side. So there's really no technical reason why each party can't reach out and talk to that same person. In fact, we had a client that was doing that en masse, and their customers were like, whoa, what's all this communication? So you almost have to have that alignment at a philosophical level when you start getting some of those tools, and even like Pendo or other tools that you can message in app to your customers. I mean, there's so many permutations and combinations now of how people can reach that end customer. That philosophical alignment becomes pretty important.
Yeah, it would be so awesome because marketing has this amazing expertise of understanding the customers and understanding what messages resonate, and also understanding what's important for the company at the time. To be able to share that expertise with the customer facing organizations, because they tend not to be particularly good sort of communicators of messages. They tend to be like, how, they're on a call for a period of time, so they have things they need to get to either by phone or sometimes, kind of in old days in person. So how do you leverage that expertise so that it doesn't get to be Wild West, where people are just using blunt force, like sending emails, which may or may not be the best way to get messages across, particularly in organizations where, like, all day, every day, you have support people talking to clients, you have CSMs talking to clients, you have services or implementation teams talking to clients. And these are frequently the ones with the biggest growth opportunities, because the enterprise clients tend to get more of the high touch. How do you pull together those messages so that there is, we're talking about like account-based marketing, but let's account-based experience. What is the messaging you want to get new people in? What is the messaging around growing existing when you have all of these different touch points.
Hey Rod, where have you seen an example of a company that actually did the sort of flip side of that, which is where marketers were really well able to take advantage of the insights from customer success or professional services teams to understand what is and isn't working with the customers, what things they need, what language they use. I often don't see marketers tapping into that as much as they should. Would love to hear from you how they, how you've seen it work really well, if you have.
Yeah. Well, we did have an example at Marketo, which I don't know is like a best practice, but there was someone in our customer marketing function whose job it was, he was in the marketing team, but he was tied to our post-sale organizations. And so he was helping us to create offerings and price them. He was helping us to execute promotions when they came up. He was helping us get into the cadence of the email or the marketing, the Marketo communications we were sending out to clients. So it was never as much as we would want, right? The customer facing teams might want more, but at least it was some, and it was a voice into the organization. And so the types of companies I think that are doing that well have some type of customer marketing role whose that individual's metrics or KPIs are not necessarily tied to the new logos, but are tied somewhere to retention, expansion, sometimes net promoter score, which is a little bit harder to tie to the metrics that marketing or sales might care about. But at least it's a voice into the organization, which I find helpful. A little bit farther down are organizations that have sort of customer advocacy groups, where a lot of times what they're looking for are case studies or use customer references, which is helpful, right? Again, it's figuring out what are the messages and listening for it. And that can be another example of how the post-sale teams can help marketing and sales meet its goals when there's an explicit sort of set of objectives around it.
Can I just ask your opinion of kind of getting back to functional, where ABM might sit? There's been discussions, well, wouldn't that be field marketing, or do we see that more as customer marketing? Maybe it doesn't really matter, but I'm curious to see what people think about where they've seen it done successfully and who has kind of responsibility.
Yeah, John, do you want to go and I'll share my thoughts?
Yeah,
as well.
sure. No, I could definitely jump in. So I think it really depends on the size of company. And remind me again, Linda, you're in a security company, is that
Yes.
correct? And
Yes.
how many employees do you guys have?
We're about 300,
300?
growing pretty fast. Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. In bigger companies, typically where I've seen ABM as an initiative owned is on the field marketing side of things. In security companies, I wouldn't call you a smaller company, but smaller than a big company, call it mid-market, like yours. I've seen mostly marketing kind of leading the charge, but reining in sales and customer experience as part of that process. And that would be kind of like the head of marketing. Like the head of marketing, it would be one of two major initiatives that they're going after, or one of three. If, in my experience, if you don't have that as part of one of two or one of three, then it's a why bother, because it takes a lot of energy and effort to do well. And you really need to have executive sponsorship behind that. And that executive in marketing also has to be connecting that to their head of sales and head of CX and CEO to make sure that it's a top initiative. But that would be my point of view. I don't know, Megan, what have you seen?
Yeah, I've definitely seen field for a couple of reasons. One, typically they're pretty close to sales. So they already have that good relationship. So this is sort of just an add-on. I've also seen it in demand, but that has the problem of it being often about just net new. So you sort of lose the whole expansion piece, and actually field transitions better into that bigger picture. Often they're being pulled into doing retention and expansion work, even if they're not gold on it, because they're close to sales, and sales and other people out in the field say, I need that help. So marketing says, okay, I'll help. Like they want to do that. So especially in Europe and sort of regional marketing teams, that works really well. They're naturally account-based. So I see that. But I would say then you get into the problem of our friend, the field marketer, ending up being a, sort of jack of all trades, master of none, right? So they are doing customer marketing, they're doing a little bit of demand, they're doing, events planning, they're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So making sure that you go back and say, if we're going account-based, what do we see as sort of the evolution of that program, and how do we want to test it? And then how do we want to progress it? Because it may be that ultimately your demand, your field, and your customer marketing actually need to be more like one team that are aligned to different pieces of the whole.
Right.
But a start with field marketing to me is, and then second place goes to demand. I wish it could be customer marketing, but very often that's a glorified name for advocacy.
Okay, I was just going to ask then, what is the customer marketing if not cross-sell, upsell, renewal?
So it could be that, right? And if there's a disconnect between net new demand and customer marketing, if they're cross-sell and upsell, well, that's not going to, you need to connect those things. Like, they're related and they should be leveraging some of the same inputs from product marketing and other people. And back to you, Rod, too, post-sale roles, right? So that's where you want to make sure you've got that connection back into CS and services and all those other great kind of contributors.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, Rod, when we were kind of preparing for this too, a role that we don't always see marketing tap into post-sale folks for, which is pipeline acceleration. What are some, I think that's a really, really great suggestion, is to say, how do we help a customer feel confident about the experience they're going to have as a way to get them closer to saying yes? What are your thoughts on that one? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into this topic of using those post-sale teams very strategically as part of your account-based growth mindset. A lot of times these large companies, I actually have two clients now that are sort of in the same boat, where their solution is being tried in one business unit in one region. And if that works, they know that it will expand into other business units within a region and then across other global regions. But it's intentional that it's starting in this one group. How does the post-sale team know that this particular opportunity is the sort of like the proof of concept, maybe not free, but they're going to use it, but is still going to be a proof point for a decision by other businesses in that region and ultimately for others, compared to other projects that look exactly the same, right? Same type of purchase, same type of users, so that they're somehow prioritized and they're listening for the stories. They are capturing the testimonials. They're making sure maybe there's some special extra attention to it. Keeping marketing and sales involved along the way to make sure that you're getting roadblocks out. So I think that's where these post-sale teams can be like really accretive in helping to accelerate, that account-based strategy. If, right, that requires a really good sales handoff. The sales team saying, hey, this is the beginning of something that could be pretty big. And it really being differentiated too, right? The risk is that the sales team says, every customer you have is the beginning of something big. And that may or may not be the case, but thinking about following through on it so that it's not just like the account-based marketing that drops it off in sales and then you lose a little bit of the momentum there, and then it drops it off in professional services or implementations, or sometimes even a partner, right? You lose even more visibility if the partner's doing the implementation, to just have that account strategy.
Yeah, I love that, right? And that kind of gets into the idea too, that some bad customer relationships actually start before the sale is closed. Right. Not because they had a bad experience with the seller, but because they got promised something that's a disconnect with how it's going to be delivered. And I think having the thank you, Linda, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nice
to meet you, Rod.
Thank you, Linda.
But I think, having the people that will be responsible for execution be part of those discussions to make sure it's scoped appropriately, that's a big deal, and I wish there was a more efficient way to make that happen. Maybe that's a next evolution.
Yeah. Well, one of the funny questions I get from professional services leaders that I talk to in these group forums or my clients is, do all these companies have these challenges with sales handoffs? And, yeah, and you have to deal with it. I mean, the practical answer is that each of us have goals, And sales job is to bring in new clients, and ideally they're all well informed and expectations are set clearly. But you also have to be realistic that sometimes it doesn't entirely match, and the post-sale teams have to struggle through. The communication is important, right? If the best situation is the salesperson, passes along information, here's what they want, here are some of the questions, here are some of the objections that they had, and just be aware of it. That it doesn't need to be perfect. It's just that communication can be helpful in building that trust and relationship.
That's awesome advice. Definitely good advice there at the end. And just looking at time here, I think we're brushing up against the bottom of the hour. Any closing thoughts, Rod, on this whole customer experience and marketing relationship, or anything else that you want to end with?
Yeah, I'd love to see the senior customer facing leaders and the senior marketing leaders collaborate a little bit more on their planning and figure out, how to identify ways that each team can help each other achieve goals, whatever that is. And just even being transparent about it, right? Having a customer leader being able to say, hey, this is whatever the CEO or CFO expect from me, and the marketing leader be able to do the same and sort of acknowledge like, hey, the marketer, the goal this quarter is lead gen because we need to accelerate new logos because our board needs to see X, Y, and Z. And then the customer team being able to say, you know what, retention dipped a little bit this quarter. We're focused on that. And just acknowledge that. Like, maybe this is not the quarter where there's collaboration, but maybe there's, hey, these guys the customer team needs to grow and expand through, add-on services. And maybe the marketing team has the same goal. Or like, hey, how can we lean on each other's teams to hit more of our customers with some of those messages? So I think communication, sharing of information, transparency, and and kind of building it into the planning, I think are key things to think about.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Rod. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to catch up and hear some of the work that you're doing too. It sounds like some exciting stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great talking with you, Megan. Great talking with you, John. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Megan, who do we have on next week?
Next week, we have Lisa Schnarre. She has her own company that is focused on basically helping companies quickly set up SDR functions. She's been a multi-time SDR function leader who really saw kind of an opportunity to make a bit of a career transition away from being an operator into being, sort of a consultant to help companies define what they need, hire and ramp their people quickly. So it's a pretty neat part of the market, but she's got a great point of view on also the sort of requirements for personalization and how to get past sort of just paying that lip service and actually helping your SDRs do a great job of it and giving them the skills that they need. So excited to hear from her next week.
Yeah, no, that personalization is such a tough problem too. So excellent. Well, Rod, thanks again for coming out so early in the morning, and another great week, and we'll look forward to doing it again next Friday at 11 o'clock Eastern.
Thanks.
Thanks again, Rod.